This week, the Toronto Star has been staggering their release of their investigation into an unprecedented leak of 11.5 million documents regarding offshore tax havens. I spoke to Robert Cribb, the Toronto Star's lead investigator and Ryerson journalism instructor, and here's what he had to say. So just to catch students up, can you walk me through kind of what the Panama Papers are and how they landed on your desk?
So the Panama Papers are effectively a leaked database, 11.5 million records, billed as the biggest ever leak of confidential documents ever. And they were obtained by a German newspaper and then shared with something called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the ICIJ, which is basically an organization that brings in partners from around the world, media partners, to work on big, massive public policy issue stories. Okay. So they called me in September and said, we'd like you to be part of this. The Toronto Star and the CBC are the two Canadian partners. Okay. So we joined this coalition, we agreed to the terms and conditions. And then I went to Munich for the big meeting at which this database was unveiled to everybody. It was astonishing, massive, incredibly detailed, thousands of names, including a whole bunch of Canadians that we ultimately found. And we worked for 9 months staring at these documents until we published on Monday.
When you guys made the decision to publish, was it a kind of a joint decision with the other people involved in the ICIJ? You mentioned there were like 350, or how many partners are there?
There's 370 journalists, about 100 news organizations. And yeah, it was very clear that we published together. That was one of the main terms and conditions that you have to agree to when you enter into this. So there's an embargo, no one can go ahead of time. We have to ensure that we're giving credit to the coalition. And so the date actually changed, and it changed twice. The deadline changed.
Really,
Everyone had to abide by the deadline.
What was the original deadline?
I'm trying to remember. I think it was late February.
Okay. And
then there was a March deadline, and then ultimately got changed to early April, to Monday.
Okay. So in this situation, obviously there was a whistleblower involved, kind of bringing these documents to the ICIJ, who eventually brought it to you guys in September. Were there any precautions taken kind of by the Star itself in ensuring kind of that, you know, the whistleblower was protected?
Yeah, so I don't know who the whistleblower is.
Right, okay. So I guess that's
there's a great advantage to not knowing who the whistleblower is. So if at any point police come to us and say, tell us who that was, I can honestly say I don't know who that is.
Right.
So that wasn't a concern so much for us. The big concern for us was proving the authenticity, because when you don't know who the whistleblower is and you don't know how or why it was obtained or released, you then have to figure out, is it real?
Right.
And so that was a test put to me by the lawyers at the Toronto Star and my editors to prove that what we're about to publish, which is filled with scathing allegations against very powerful people, that it's based on records that are authentic and not somehow a massive fraud for forgery. So that took a long time. That took a lot of convincing. And the only way that ultimately we were able to do it is to take what we had from the leak and test it against what we could show in the real world through using public documents, interviews, making sure that the portrait that's painted by the documents can be somehow verified independently. And so that took a very, very long time. We got to a point where we believed the sheer volume, the number of facts, the details were simply, it would be impossible to somehow forge all of this.
Yeah.
And it started checking out with a whole bunch of other independent public records. And then ultimately we put all of this to the law firm itself from which the documents came, and they didn't deny it. In fact, nobody denied it all along the way. There wasn't any point where anyone that we've researched said none of this is true. They came up with defenses saying, you know, we do what we do and it's legal, and we deny allegations of impropriety, but nobody said those documents aren't real.
So speaking on that point, you mentioned this isn't legal, and tax evasion, even this type, isn't necessarily illegal in Canada, correct?
Tax avoidance is not illegal. There's actually a distinction.
But these tax havens, I guess, to clarify.
Evasion is illegal.
Right.
But all of it's very, very gray.
Okay.
And one of the things that this story points out, I think, to me anyway, one of the revelations is that it's one of those stories that lives in this gray area, this distinction between what is legal and what is right. And sometimes there's a difference between those two things.
Yeah.
And this is a story that really points, it's one of those examples of something that may be legal. It may, in fact, lawyers could, in some cases, honestly say this is entirely legal. In many cases here, they could say it's entirely legal. But it raises another question, which is it right that $6 to $8 billion a year in Canada is diverted out of the federal treasury and into anonymous companies with figurehead directors in tropical islands where it's not taxed? That's a different question.
Right. Okay. So speaking on that, I guess, earlier today, Prime Minister Trudeau said that the Canadian government has long known about these tax havens, and he reiterated his campaign promise that he will hold the rich to account and ensure that they pay their fair share of taxes. Yeah. Do you think we'll see a shift in the way that the Canadian government handles tax evasion and attempts to deal with tax havens in general?
So my hope is the answer to that is yes. One would hope so. We haven't had a particularly good record on this as a country. I don't think that we're very evolved in our public discussion on this. When's the last time you've heard a radio show or anyone talking about, tax evasion and tax havens? It's not on the public radar screen in this country. I think Trudeau did throw some money at Revenue Canada to look at this, to his credit, and that came before this leak. I think the leak has hit such a nerve, not only in Canada, but globally. I mean, we're seeing world leaders stepping down under intense pressure. The scandals are everywhere around the world. It's amazing. And so one would hope that the international community might address this more vigorously, because it is an international problem. To some extent, there's only so much Canada can do.
Right.
This is a problem where as long as there's places where you can go to put that money safely and legally, what can Canada really do? But there are domestic issues that Canada can deal with, and they can certainly go more aggressively after tax cheats. And I think Trudeau has indicated that he's interested in doing that. So I think that's good news for us.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the kind of the global impact that this has had so far. You mentioned that the world leader, the Iceland Prime Minister, stepped down. We've seen, Chinese media or Chinese state media sort of censoring these stories coming out. I think we've seen things like, France, I think, blacklisted Panama on their tax list. And then the Prime Minister of England is on blast right now for his link to this, or his alleged link to this. Yeah. What kind of reaction have you seen from the Canadian public?
Well, I've never done anything that has triggered this much reaction in terms of emails and calls and genuine outrage.
Yeah.
It's truly amazing, actually. I've been blindsided by it, because you're sort of buried in this cocoon for 9 months, and suddenly you publish, and then bam, it's been a nuclear explosion. It really has, yeah. So we don't have, like some of these other countries, we don't have high-profile politicians that are in our database. So we're not having the kind of political scandals as everyone else. But there is, I think, when it comes to the fundamental issues around the operation of our tax system and the fact that in some ways it facilitates the movement, or at the very least doesn't aggressively go after this movement of wealth offshore, that is just as intense as anywhere else in the world. I mean, Canadians are not pleased.
Yes. So speaking, I guess, to that again, in 2013, Prime Minister Stephen Harper signed a trade agreement with Panama. Yeah. It was similar to his trade agreement signed with the United States, that a lot of people were worried would cause this kind of tax haven problem to be exacerbated and to be harder to crack down on. Do you think that this trade agreement will in any way kind of inhibit the way that the Canadian government is able to deal with the revelations we've seen from this investigation?
So that's the next phase that we need to look at, right?
Yeah.
So Canada signed those kinds of agreements with numerous tax havens like Costa Rica and the BVI, which is a notorious tax haven. We have a tax agreement with those people. Luxembourg, Switzerland. Mm-hmm. So it really raises puzzling questions that I still haven't figured out. Why do we do that? I mean, it's not like signing with the United States. We have a huge economic relationship with the United States. There's a huge free flow of money between those. Right. Canadians want to invest in the United States. They want to do business there. There's tons of good reasons why you sign trade deals and tax agreements with the United States or Britain or Australia. Why we sign it with the BVI and Costa Rica? Is there really that much Canadian industry moving down? Is there really a need for that? it's utterly puzzling to me, and what it serves to do, whether intentionally or unintentionally, is to help facilitate the movement of Canadian wealth to these places,
Right.
where they avoid taxation. I just don't get it.
So that's kind of, I guess, the next step is
I think we all have to, I think journalists across this country have to have a really close look at the history of tax agreements with places that we know to be harbingers of tax-free income.
So the Star has staggered their release of their kind of findings with this investigation throughout the past week. What can we look forward to seeing in the coming days?
So tomorrow we have a major piece on China, which is the story that's really triggered intense reaction from the Chinese government. As you know, they've essentially censored all stories on the internet dealing with Mossack Fonseca and the leak. The story about how Chinese leaders used these offshore companies is an utterly fascinating tale. Friday, I have a piece running. It's a fascinating look. It's a change of pace kind of story looking at effectively Nazi looted art and how it turned up in this database. And it's a fascinating tale of this Modigliani painting from 1918 and how art plays such an interesting role in the movement of wealth offshore. Like art is a particularly useful tool for storing wealth because it's mobile, it's movable, it's easily shipped across borders, and it's extremely valuable.
Right.
So it shows up in this database, which you wouldn't. What I like about this story is it's not the typical kind of offshore hit. It's not about money.
There's no dollar signs.
There's no paper here. It's about art, but how art can play an incredibly interesting and hidden role in for the rich to move their money.
Cool. So before we wrap, you teach an investigative journalism class at Ryerson. Would you say that you're instilling students with the kind of skills necessary to go and eventually find these kind of stories and work with them?
I think that's probably up to them to answer better than me, but I certainly am trying to do that.
Yeah.
All the skills, all the tools, all the techniques that I used in this story are all the things we talk about upstairs in the classroom. So.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. For Ryersonian TV, I'm Dylan Bell.